We are reading chapter 14 of the Crossroads. Jamie couldn't focus in school. When Mises asked him to demonstrate on the whiteboard how to figure out 150% of 45, he said, "No, thank you," which resulted in staying in during morning recess. He'd forgotten to make his lunch and sat by himself in the cafeteria staring at a blank page of his sketchbook and doing his best to ignore Diego. "It sucks when your mom doesn't like you enough to pack you a lunch," Diego said when he passed Jamie's table on the way to the other side of the cafeteria. Jamie twirled the pen in his hand, wondering if he could fling it at Diego like a javelin. Instead, he drew a deep line in his sketchbook that tore the page. He liked it better when he understood less. "Aren't you hungry?" Jamie looked into the purple-rimmed glasses and wide black eyes of Carla. He could feel his own face matching the colors of her frames. "No food." He pointed to everyone else's lunch and shrugged before realizing he should have lied and said he'd eaten already. He wanted Carla to think he was cool, not pitiful. She set her tray down and pointed to the hot lunch line. "You can get some free lunch." He looked at her in disbelief. Did free lunch mean what he thought it did? Why would anyone, especially in this country that hated immigrants and jailed them for no reason, give him free lunch? Either she could read minds or he spoke his concerns aloud in perfect English without even knowing it, because she grabbed him by the arm and led him to the lunch line. "Hola, hola, Juanita." She greeted the lunch lady and then continued in English. "This is Jamie. He needs some food." She walked over to the table and waved for him to come. He shook his head no. She sighed and brought the form over to him. "Have your parents fill this out so you qualify for free or reduced meals." "I don't think I..." He stopped himself before saying anything else. Juanita seemed nice, but she couldn't go around telling everyone who spoke Spanish that he didn't have papers. Juanita waved the form at him again. "Doesn't hurt to fill it out anyway. Anyone can do it." Jamie read through the Spanish form she handed him. It asked how much his family, Tomas, made per year. No clue. Information about food allergies. None. And basic questions like his name and school. Nothing about his immigration status. "Now I can't have you starving all day. Juanita pointed to each of the two gray slops of food in front of her. "Do you want beef or cheesy mushrooms?" "Go with the mushrooms," Carla motioned to the less gray one on her left. "It's actually really good with the pasta." "Bueno." He shrugged at the mushrooms, though honestly, they weren't his favorite. He doubted he'd notice if he were eating brains. He already felt like a zombie. Donna Juanita piled his tray with the mushroom, pasta, and green vegetable, a red apple, a sugar cookie, and a carton of milk. A group of girls had moved their lunches to the table where Jamie had been sitting, saving them both a spot in the middle. Carla jumped into their conversation as soon as they sat back down. A few times, Carla or one of the other girls asked him a question, and he lifted his shoulders to say he didn't know, or he wasn't sure what they were asking or talking about. He ate all his food, just like Abuela had taught him. But afterwards, he couldn't have said what anything tasted like. Honestly, he wasn't even sure what happened the rest of the day. On the bus back home, next to Sean, he hugged his knees to his chest and shook his head no when Sean placed a hand on his shoulder to ask him what was wrong. When Miguel was killed, there was nothing that could bring him back. With Abuela being attacked, the damage had already been done and he was too far away to help out. But Don was here, in a detention center, not yet deported. There had to be a way to help him. If there were a movie, Jamie would organize some kind of jailbreaking that involved tools baked into cakes, blacked out secret cameras, and underground tunnels. But in the real life, he knew none of that would work. For one thing, he didn't know how to bake a cake. As much as he thought He couldn't think of anything that would realistically change what the future held. Don would have to return to a country he no longer called home. Not being able to change the past was as helpless. It was a helpless fact of life. Not being able to change the future made the helplessness 100 times worse. A wave of intense heat hit as soon as Jamie left the air-conditioned bus. Not the humid heat from back home, but a dry heat that seemed to beat down directly from the sun and cause the spring shoots to curl up in hiding. No sweat gathered on his forehead as if it evaporated before reaching the surface of his skin. He would hardly believe that just last week snow reached his knees and his ears burned with cold. He waited at the entrance of Mr. George's ranch for a long time as he scanned the ridge and rolling hills of property. Maybe Tomas had been lucky at the sheriff's office and the police were able to pull some strings. Maybe the detention center realized their mistake and Don didn't belong there with the criminals. Any minute a bird call would echo over the ridge and the horse would come galloping across the desert, dodging cacti and rocks. But no, Don did not ride up to meet him. Jamie began the long walk back to the trailer. He turned with a bend in the road, and the sun shone right into his eyes. He squinted and kept walking. The sound of an angry insect caused Jamie to stop. He shielded his eyes and glanced around him. Nothing. He looked around again before looking down. There, not more than 2 hands' length from his foot, lay a coiled snake. Its triangular head lifted from its flat, diamond-patterned body, and its forged tongue flitted from its mouth. The noise continued. The snake's tail shook to create the noise Jamie mistook for an insect. Other than the snake's tail and tongue, nothing moved. He couldn't either. Not with his foot so close and his jeans not thick enough to prevent a bite. Snakes sensed motion and could strike faster than the eye could see. Jamie blinked and forced himself to breathe calmly. Back home, he and Maguel sometimes caught snakes, held them for a few minutes, or Maguel would hold them while Jamie drew them in his sketchbook, and then set them free. Only from afar, and Jamie encountered a venomous snake, and he was pretty sure this one was not the kind you picked up and relocated. They stood there, staring at each other. The snake's glare was so intense, Jamie wondered if it could even see him, or if it was compensating for its poor vision by focusing extra hard. After a few minutes, Jamie figured the snake probably wasn't going to strike unless it felt threatened. It had had plenty of opportunity, and even if it was hungry, it had to know it couldn't swallow Jamie whole. So they'd reached a stalemate. Jamie couldn't move because the snake would misinterpret the action as a threat, and the snake couldn't move because, if it was a snake, and incapable of logical thinking. The snake continued to give him an evil stare until it seemed convinced that Jamie would neither attack him nor turn into a bite-sized morsel. Finally, it uncoiled its body and slithered into the bushes, making an extra tally on its scoreboard. Snake 1,527,952. Scared mindless human 1. It took several minutes for Jamie to be able to continue on his way and several more for his ears to stop pounding with the sound of his heartbeat. He turned his gaze to the dirt road and shuffled his feet down the long track to the trailer. About halfway back, his brain buzzing with thoughts of Dawn, fighting off snakes that came up through the plumbing and the detention center, the sound of an engine interrupted his revelry. Tomas! Except instinct told him it wasn't. Too loud, like the roar of a diesel engine. Tomas's truck ran on gasoline. Because of the curves in the road, no vehicle was visible, but a cloud of dust rose over the nearest hill. Jamie crouched behind a juniper bush on the side of the road. His uniform shirt was green today and his jeans were blue. He prayed he wouldn't be seen. He also prayed that Senor didn't have the spring cottage hidden nearby. The truck was huge, white, shiny, and new with 4 tires on the back wheels. The driver wore a tan felted cowboy hat over his gray hair. He had a look of authority on his red face as he zoomed by. Immigrations had found them. Jamie took off as soon as it passed. By the time the dust settled, the truck was out of sight around the next curve. There was no way he could get home before the vehicle, even if he had a horse. He doubted the horse could outrun the truck. All he could do was hope that Tomas had told Donichichi about the vampire rule and not letting immigration officers in. With the homestead in sight, Jamie paused to catch his breath. He left the track and cut across the field to sneak up closer. He was so focused on avoiding any long twigs or coiled ropes that could be a snake, he forgot about the other natural dangers. He left his left sneaker collided with a cactus, and he bit his lip to keep from crying out. No time to pull out the spines. He limped forward with one eye on the ground and one eye on the homestead. The truck stood in front of the kitchen door to the big house, and Jamie limped behind another juniper. Could he possibly go around the other side, enter through the front door, and get Donichichi out before the officer found him? Unlikely. Donichichi lived in the annex next to the kitchen. A diversion then. The cows with their newborn calves were still in the corral instead of grazing with the rest of the herd throughout the vast ranch. If he could cause a stampede, then his plan stopped as 2 figures walked toward the fancy new truck. The red-faced officer and Tomas. He couldn't let them take Tomas again, except his legs refused to move. Tomas didn't look like he was in any immediate danger. He walked normally beside the man, but his head hung low, so Jamie couldn't read his expressions. They stopped in front of the truck. The red-faced officer leaned against the hood with his arms crossed over his broad chest. The 2 men were talking, but too far away for their voices to carry. The officer finally pushed himself upright and shook Tomas's hand before entering the kitchen of the big house, as if he owned the place. Tomas looked after the man. His shoulders slumped, and then he turned, dragging his boots back to the trailer. Jamie waited in his spot for a few more minutes before bursting toward the trailer. The cactus spines poked through his shoe to prick his toes at every step, but he couldn't slow down. He leapt up the metal steps and threw the door open. Who was that? Tomas leaned on the table, resting his head on his arms. He looked up and stared at Jamie with red, sleepless eyes. That's Mr. George. I have to find 2 replacements for Don immediately, preferably guys with papers. And he dropped his head back into his arms with a thunk that made the table collapse.